Hey, y'all, I'm Kim Stewart, host of the Book Marketing Mania podcast, and I'm so glad you're tuning in today. In my last episode, I shared how to create your podcast pitching strategy, which is your why, which is your goals for pitching, your who, your target readers you're trying to reach, your what, which is your topics and stories you're going to pitch, and your where, which is the types of podcast you want to pitch. And again, like I said before, having the strategy in place makes it so much easier to guide your research, use your resources wisely, and avoid all the back and forth if you're outsourcing to your VA. And speaking of VAs, if you're interested in offering your services to help authors research podcasts, send me a DM because I always have authors asking me, and I'd love to support you and refer you. Plus, fun fact, episode 21 with my guest, Kristen Crum, where we talked about offering your VA services to authors, has been my second most downloaded episode. So I know authors need this support. So on today's episode, I want to share some easy ways for you to search and vet podcasts that you can pitch to be a guest on. Searching podcasts can be very time consuming. Ask me how I know if you aren't intentional and strategic. So let's get to it. So my number one easiest and fastest way to find podcasts that interview Christian authors is to search out where similar authors and bloggers have been a guest. And I'll also add to that, search podcast host, because a lot of hosts in our niche are also authors, and being a guest on other podcasts is the number one way to grow your own show. So you'll see lots of hosts guesting on each other's shows. And if you're following along from my last episode and have jotted down some notes on your pitching strategy, you've probably already jotted down the types of podcast, names of similar authors and bloggers down on your strategy under your where. So to search and find shows by guest names, simply go into your favorite podcast player. I use Apple Podcasts, but you could also use Spotify, Listen Notes, etc., and enter the author's name in the search field, and podcasts will pop up where they have guested. Then you can click on those shows and quickly vet those according to your strategy. Are they still releasing current episodes? Is the audience they speak to your target readers? Are the topics they are sharing in line with your own topics? And if so, jot the shows down on a spreadsheet to track your research. I have one in my Podcast Pitching 101 mini course with a tab for research and then a tab for pitching. And that helps too if you're outsourcing. Your VA can research the shows for you and make notes for you. And if you find them a fit, then you can move them over to your tab for pitching and tracking. Now, I'll also add, when you're looking at the show itself within your podcast app, you can also scroll down to the bottom and find similar shows too. And so like in Apple, I'll see You Might Also Like at the bottom, and I can check out those shows too. Also, you can access the URL of the show in Apple by clicking on the three little horizontal dots next to the show. I think it's called the ellipsis menu, or somebody mentioned it called a meatballs menu, which I think is hilarious. And copy that URL to your browser, and then pull that up and scroll down, and you'll see a link that says Top Podcast in XYZ category. So if you were searching out Christian podcasts, they might be in the Christianity category, and then you can click on that link, and then you'll see all the top 200 podcasts in that category, and you could go searching there as well. Now, remember I said this can be time consuming if you're not strategic. So remember, you're always looking for shows that interview guests and are releasing current episodes. And the best way to do that is to search by guest name, especially authors who have recently released books. Obviously, they're getting interviewed on shows that do interview guests, and they're releasing current episodes. So in my last episode, I also talked about thinking beyond your book of the topics you want to talk about. Maybe you want to talk about your journey as an author. Maybe you're also an entrepreneur who offers coaching or courses. I imagine if you're guesting on podcasts and sharing those topics, bringing value in your 30 to 40 minute conversation, your listeners are going to hear that you're an author in your bio. They're going to hear your website link mentioned. They're going to see it in the show notes. They're going to click over and they're going to discover more about you, i.e. your book, even if it wasn't the topic of your conversation. So in your podcast player, you could search out guest names that you know are talking to your target audience. Maybe they're not an author, but you've seen them as guest speakers on online summits or speakers at events you dream of speaking at. Maybe they're your competitors. Maybe they're your dream referral partners serving your target audience before or after they need your own services. Maybe you see them sharing on Instagram all the publications and TV interviews where they've been featured. They've probably been guests on podcasts too, so jot their names down, search out the shows that they've been on, and see if they're a fit for you. So when you're in your podcast player, you can also search out the keywords in your topics or the keywords describing your audience to find new shows. You can also do this on Google, but it's so much easier in one of the podcast players because you can click on the show right away, see what guests they've had, see what topics they've had. Again, you can see how time-consuming and never-ending the research can be. Be sure to set a timer to keep yourself on track or outsource your research to a VA or intern. Here's another great tip for finding shows. Search Facebook groups for podcasts. So some of the Facebook groups that you hang out in on a daily basis or you check in on and you're a member of, go search out podcasts and see what people have been sharing. Somebody might have posted in there, hey, what are your favorite podcasts to listen to? Or they might have specific threads for you to share. So I want to say first, when you're joining and engaging in any Facebook group, please follow and be respectful of the rules of the group. So 2 of my favorite groups to find Christian podcasts that interview guests are, first, the Christian Podcasters Association, led by Eric Nevins, who hosts the Halfway There podcast. His Facebook group, there's about 3,000 members in the group. And if you listen to episode 12, where I spotlighted author Sarah Geringer, you heard her share how she's connected with so many hosts in the group that have led to her being interviewed on their podcast. Eric also gives some great tips on pitching yourselves to podcasts through his email list. And thanks, Eric, for giving me a shout out in appreciation of the personalized pitch I recently sent him for a client of mine. So the second Facebook group I would recommend is Spark Christian Podcast Community, led by Misty Phillip, who hosts the By His Grace podcast. Y'all have heard me talk a ton about Spark here on the podcast, and it's a great community to be a part of. There's about 1,000 members. And in both of these Facebook groups, you're going to find threads in the group for hosts to share their most recent episodes. So like once a week, you'll see that pop up. So you know those shows are releasing current episodes. Then you'll see threads for be a guest and or find a guest where you can post that you'd like to be a guest, or you'll see hosts looking for guests and you can see if you're a fit for them. And I'll be sure and link to these in the show notes. And again, if you have topics to speak on outside of your book, I know in addition to being an author, many of you are also mental health professionals, or you offer coaching or services and your target audiences are more broad. There's also a huge podcast guest collaboration Facebook group hosted by the Podcast Collab Club, and I'll also link that in the show notes. It has like 30,000 members in all genres where you can post that you want to be a guest. Again, follow and respect the rules of the group, and I'll link all these in the show notes. And speaking of podcast collabs, there are several paid services out there now that can match you as a guest with podcast host, or vice versa as a host with guest. And my mentor, Angie Trueblood, host of the Go Pitch Yourself podcast, and I are going to be recording an episode later this month to review some of these services, and I can't wait to share it with you. Okay, so lastly, if you tuned in to episode 27 with my guest, Thomas Umstad Jr., you heard us talk about his podcast host directory included in his membership, where you can search out podcasts in all genres and find their email address. I'll be sure to link to that in the show notes too. Woo, y'all. We don't call this book marketing mania for nothing. It's crazy all the ways you can go about finding podcasts to guest on. Again, you want to be super strategic. And now that you've found your ideal shows, let's get pitching. So next episode, I'm going to share how to pitch a podcast. And if you need help in the meantime, check out my Podcast Pitching 101 mini course at bookmarketingmania.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to connect with me on Instagram at KimStuInspired. I'd love to help answer them. Thanks for tuning in today, and I'll see you in 2 weeks to help you market your book one podcast at a time.